everybody, Jamin here from Game Show with my weekly vlog update. So I wanted to take a look at a very, very interesting development that's happening in the world of a game called Rust, which is a big, incredibly popular PC-based open world type game. It's engendered a lot of very strange activities amongst its players. But in an update by the devs, most recently 2 weeks ago, they made a really, really interesting change. They added a bunch of different races. Now you might be saying, look, there's lots of games that have different races in them. Here's the catch. In Rust, the race and the facial features are actually chosen for you. So it's not like there's a character creator and you can sort of decide what race you want to be. Rust totally decides, and it's linked to your Steam account. So it's absolutely the same from game to game. Before, all the characters were white and kind of clone-like, so it adds obviously a spot of diversity, and not everyone gets a unique skin tone and face. So the faces piece of it, as the developers have noted, is a bit of a work in progress. But here's what's really, really interesting about it. They made some really interesting observations about the nature of race. I mean, obviously some people are not happy about the fact that you might just end up as an Asian guy or as a black guy, which is sort of ironic because in a lot of games, for example, that I have to play, that sort of decision is made for me. So there's an interesting bit of comeuppance there in terms of getting characters who are non-white or players who are non-white to sort of experience what it's like for everyone else who doesn't get to choose, which is the vast majority of games. One of the interesting things that Gary Newman had said was that players it was really interesting because they had sort of established this world where all the characters were white. It was really, really difficult to introduce non-white characters into the game. For example, the darker characters, because they felt quote unquote blacked up. And he actually linked to a page about blackface. The reason why is if you see all the characters are white all the time, any kind of additional skin tone sort of makes you feel like it's perhaps quote unquote too dark. He also said, this was really interesting in the blog post, that it shows you how arbitrary race actually is. Now, here's what's really cool. This experiment by Rust is virtually unheard of. Obviously I've talked a lot about race in games and how there is obviously a lot of underrepresentation on the side of game characters. And some of this is technical, as I've talked about in the past. Some of it has roots in chiaroscuro, for example, and that black characters are often placed in the background and lighter characters are placed in the foreground. That's a common thing that's taught to artists as part of art theory, and it's part of sort of how we understand Western art. Obviously that's no excuse, but one of the other big reasons why we don't see as much of these kinds of experiments is because it's rooted in the technology itself. So if you go back to the original NES, it was only capable of spitting out 54 different colors, which really isn't a lot. I'll link to an interesting post that David D'Angelo, the designer behind Shovel Knight, where he talked about some of the constraints that they had in terms of trying to make a new old game, basically a game that is made with modern technology but is sort of made to look like an old NES game. And color is one of the things that was actually really, really difficult for them, particularly getting darker tones. So then, after that, there's also these games that have character generators as well, so you can choose what your race is, and that's certainly a step forward. Again, it's nothing like this experiment in Rust, and it's a step forward. However, there are a lot of kind of problems along the way. So like in Fallout 3, for example, selecting a black character would result in these gross green splotches on a character's face. Or if you go in GTA Online and you go into a salon, you'll find a list of possible haircuts for the player, yet there's only 2 that have an afro texture, or cornrows. In Dragon's Age, for example, if you make a dark-skinned character, like the noble background, your parents will be noticeably white, which just sort of implies that the character isn't actually black or is adopted or whatever it might be. There's an interesting thread in Reddit that I'll actually link to, and part of the problem is that race is more than just skin tone. It's more than just sort of color. It's facial features as well. So it's not always just enough to say, oh, we're going to have a wide variety of different sort of skin texture, skin tones, but not have a different facial structure. So for me, for example, I have slightly high cheekbones, which comes from my mother's side, which is a total mix of Mexican, Welsh, and English, but then my hair is sort of a mix of my mom and my dad's. My dad is black, it's obviously a lot tighter curls, a bit nappier. My mom's is totally straight, she's very fair for being Mexican, and so I end up with this kind of amalgam of facial features. I guess you could just change the skin tone or whatever, but that wouldn't really fully capture kind of my racial identity. What's interesting, I always try to look at these things from an outside context. I think that this experiment at Rust speaks to some larger things that are happening outside of the world of games as well. One good antecedent to this idea that sort of a character's race, which is what is arbitrary, which is basically what Gary Newman, the developer, says. Like, it really shows you when you change the character's race in Rust. It shows you how arbitrary those distinctions are. One place where you're seeing some of these experiments is actually on Broadway, where there's this legacy of what's called colorblind casting, right? So obviously, if you have a play, for example, like Billy Elliot, that's a specific person. But on Broadway, they've also tried to sort of increase diversity by trying to have non-white characters play traditionally white characters. For example, Keke Palmer has been playing Cinderella. I mean, there's nothing in Cinderella's story that makes her white. It's just that, that's how we sort of know her from the Disney movies, for example. So it's cool to see casting directors sort of experiment with that. Also, obviously, Idris Elba in Thor, which obviously also caused some backlash as well. But it's nice to see. I think that this experiment by the developers of Rust is a really, really important one. I don't think that they're trying to make a political statement or anything like that. I think that they just wanted to introduce diversity into this world, and they thought it'd be really interesting is like if you took the choice away. Because remember, whenever there's lots of games in which the choice of who you are is taken away from you. In fact, that's most games. There's a particular character. There's no custom character creator or whatever. You're just sort of given this person. So it should then follow that it really shouldn't be that controversial to just make someone, when they sign up to play a game, be a wide variety of different things. So I think it's an awesome experiment, and I hope they continue with it. The game is obviously still in development. I'll link to all the different things that I talked about in the description, and I look forward to your comments. I'll see you next week.